Before we begin, I'd like to recommend another history podcast I'm sure you'll find very interesting. Battleground. Best-selling historians Saul David and Patrick Bishop bring social and military history together to explore what shapes conflicts, both current and past. Just search Battleground wherever you find your podcasts. In the last World War of the 20th century, a farm boy from the rugged bushland of South Africa took to the bloody skies over Europe during World War II and made history. Embraced as a hero and one of the few by the embattled island of Britain and its king, but considered a traitor by many in his own country. Born in 1910 in Wellington, South Africa, Group Captain A.G. Sailor Malan would fight 3 battles in his life. One would end in victory over Germany.
It became known as Sailor's Day. On the 11th of August, at the height of the Battle of Britain, 74 Squadron destroyed 23 enemy aircraft.
Another would end in defeat as he took on South Africa's apartheid government.
One of the reasons they might not have arrested him was that by 1959, he was still very outspoken against apartheid, but it was also clear that he was seriously ill.
The third would end in death as a result of Parkinson's disease.
And I was relieved when he died because he was so helpless and so frustrated with this disease.
Cutting short a full, promising, yet humble life. One of Sailor Malan's 10 rules for air fighting was to always turn and face the attack. For him, this was not only true in a dogfight, it was true whenever injustice or adversity confronted you in life. This 6-episode series paints a compelling picture of the remarkable life of this, in all other respects, unremarkable, ordinary man. Face the Attack, the 3 battles of Sailor Malan, uses the terms and language of the times in which the events took place, which some may find offensive or difficult to hear. Listener discretion is advised. To receive weekly episodes, plus additional content, follow this series wherever you find your favorite podcasts. To discover more, visit facetheattack.com. Episode 6, I Fear No Man. This episode contains descriptions of and approaches to treatment for Parkinson's disease. This podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any condition or disease. We encourage listeners to consult with their own physician or healthcare specialist. A 1959 trip to London included an interview with Malan that encapsulates his life to this point. He is typically soft-spoken, a man of few words, but direct and to the point, and firm in his stance against South Africa's National Party apartheid government.
Group Captain, what do you plan to do while you're here?
Well, I have no specific plans other than meeting old acquaintances, old friends, and generally enjoying myself.
You must have a lot of Battle of Britain memories to relive. What's the sharpest single recollection of the Battle of Britain that you have?
That's a difficult question. But I think the sharpest one I can recollect is arriving in Biggin Hill from Hornchurch. We've been sent overnight to relieve the squadron that lasted 24 hours, and seeing the shambles there with no hangars standing was about my sharpest recollection.
You've been described as perhaps the greatest fighter ace of all. What would you say are the qualities that go to make the great fighter pilot?
Courage and perseverance, I'd say.
After the war in South Africa, you formed the Torch Commandos. What did you aim to achieve?
A change of government.
Why did the Torch Commandos fail?
Well, why they failed? Because public opinion was for the government in power. It's the majority of public opinion, I'd say.
Do you still disagree with the present South African government's racial policies?
I disagree with the racial policies, yes.
By the late 1950s, life for Sailor Malan and his family was idyllic. Having found peace and quiet in Kimberley, a far cry from the perils of combat against the Germans during the war and the nasty political fights against the National Party and against the emergence of apartheid, he was able to enjoy the simple pleasures of farming, dinner parties, and hunting adventures with friends. But the war had had a huge underlying effect on Malan. Even when pressed by his son, he would never talk about it and never discuss his own personal experiences and involvement.
And I started to ask my dad questions around about age 7, and was very disappointed when he wouldn't tell me anything. And I didn't realize it then, but looking back, I get the feeling that all these people who were fighting in the RAF, in the war, in different battlefronts, were quite severely traumatized by the war and never, ever wanted to revisit that again.
Due very much to the quiet acceptance of a generation that hadn't quite come to terms with shell shock or PTSD, he suffered regularly from violent nightmares.
He was traumatized by the war, told me terrible things happened. He just said, I don't want to discuss it. He was adamant about that, and I pursued it a couple of times. My mother mentioned that she woke up one night. Apparently, she woke up with this pain, and my father was thrashing around, and she had to get out of his way. He was having a nightmare. She had to wake him up and calm him down. And she said to me many years later that for some time after the war, suffered from nightmares, partly from the sheer terror of the situations that these men had to fly into. We can only imagine the terror that they must have experienced.
According to some family, there might be a direct link between Sailor's father's mental breakdown after they lost the family farm, Slent, which led to Sailor being sent off to Simonstown, which meant the end of his own childhood and his family life. That part of his refusal to talk about his own post-traumatic stress could be tied to this, and that he resented his father for what he saw as weakness in the end of his childhood and the loss of the farm, and that he feared doing the same to his own family, whom he loved dearly, and jeopardizing his own first real experience of family life and life at Benfontein.
And Crispin Trace remembers one incident where Malan's trauma sparked into anger.
On one occasion, I was with Sailor and his son Jonathan. We were walking on their farm looking for something to shoot. I don't think there was anything to shoot on Sailor's farm that he hadn't long ago shot, but anyway, we were marching around. And we had to get through a barbed wire fence. And Jonathan climbed through the fence with a loaded shotgun. Sailor actually exploded. It was like a bomb going off. He totally lost it. And to such an extent that I thought he was going to throttle Jonathan. And I pushed myself between the two of them, separated them, and I put my hand on Sailor's chest and said to him, Sailor, calm down. Please, calm down. It was like turning a switch off. He was back to himself with that from me. And I said to him then, Sailor, look, I know and you know that when we were both young, with starting off with guns, that we probably did the same thing. And we only ever did it once because we got so told off. I said the number of people that were killed and or maimed or hurt by guns going off, by people climbing through fences, was astronomical. It was something he just never did. And I said to him, you know, Jonathan's never going to do that again. I said, and I'm sure certainly it happened to me. And I said, I'd be very surprised if it didn't happen to you when you were very young as well. And I think I was right, because he was fine. He just took Jonathan's gun away and said, walk home. We had a hell of a long way to walk, but that was fine.
I think it starts as early as the families return to South Africa. Go there on a ship sailing back, and he's so suffering from such severe PTSD, he doesn't want to speak to anybody. He sits in his cabin to the point that the ship's captain allows the family to eat in his private cabin, so he doesn't have to mix with people. He doesn't want to be confronted with people saying, oh, you Sailor Malan, the great war hero. He doesn't want to talk about the war. You know, he lost 2 brothers. He's traumatized. I think, you know, being distracted by the torch commander and being distracted and living at Benfontein, I think especially the torch commander, it distracts him from his PTSD. He's surrounded by people who kind of understand where he's coming from.
Those in combat had dealt with the stresses of war in different ways. Dr. Helen Doe.
It's quite interesting how they relieved strain. You know, they're flying, the adrenaline is pumping through them all the time. You know, it's kill or be killed. they're up there for a short bursts of time, but really intense and frequently outnumbered because you've got all these bombers as well as the fighters coming across. So some of them unwind in different ways. You hear stories of sort of late night parties and being so drunk the next morning they're having to take gulps of oxygen to sober up before they fly off again. Others are taking Benzedrine and things just to keep them going. Intense stress. In my father's case, his reaction very often was, if he'd been successful, was to go away and have a quiet pint of beer on his own. So that was his way of unwinding and perhaps what helped to save him. But you can see the link between what was impacting Malan in later life. Other interesting thing is that a lot of these symptoms particularly reared themselves when that individual came to retirement in civilian life. They seemed to come up more then than before.
Malan had now also started to struggle with movement and words. A farmhand recalls having to go with Linda on some evenings to find him, as he had not returned from a walk. They would find him sitting on the ground. He had lost his balance and was unable to walk further.
And my mother told me that a couple of his friends remarked, and Silas had a little too much to drink. He was starting to dodder a little, losing his balance. And over the next year, it became worrying enough to have it checked out.
At one point, it gets bad enough that Malan goes to hospital in Johannesburg, and the doctor tells him this might be Parkinson's, which at the time was a very unknown disease.
And there are people who said he had symptoms during his torch commander days. If you look at some of the photos of those days, he's always got his left hand in his pocket. But I think as the torch commander starts to unravel and he realizes the political route South Africa is taking, I think it gets worse again. Being the tough guy, man of that period, he didn't want to go to a doctor. He didn't, he just ignored it. So I've actually spoken to someone who is related to one of the doctors he saw at that time. And one set of doctors tell him it might be Parkinson's, and another set it's an inflammation of the brain. You'll probably be fine. And here's the medication, go back, you'll be fine.
Once again, Harry Oppenheimer intervened, paying for Malan to travel to England to visit a well-regarded neurosurgeon.
The specialist in London said words to this effect: Soda, I'm not sure, but it's my opinion that the stresses of warfare had something to do with undermining the health of your nervous system. It must have been nerve-shattering, those months of being on standby. And I think my father accepted that as a reasonable explanation.
The diagnosis was shattering. Sailor Malan had Parkinson's disease. Michelle van der Zee is a physiotherapist who leads workshops for Parkinson's disease patients in South Africa. Working closely with over 150 participants, she has gained deep insight into the disease and its effects on day-to-day life.
Parkinson's is a progressive neurodegenerative disorder. So it primarily affects your motor control, that is your movement and your muscles. And it's as a result of a gradual decline of the cells in your brain which produce dopamine. Dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter for smooth movement and planning of execution of movements and processes. So without that, a person's subconscious ability to move well is affected. So they have to become a lot more conscious of smooth, proper movements. The way it affects somebody is that your everyday subconscious activities such as walking, chewing, speaking, swallowing, which we don't give much thought to, we just go about it naturally, become very difficult for somebody. So instead of being able to take steps and walk down a hallway, somebody with Parkinson's will have to be consciously kind of communicating to their feet to take a step or to swing their arms. That subconscious function of their brain starts to decline. It has many other effects, so not just on your movement, but just also on the strength of your muscles, their flexibility and general range of motion, as well as balance is affected quite a lot by Parkinson's disease.
But as well as the impact on movement and actions, Other behavior changes often manifest long before that.
So before somebody develops a tremor or slowness of walking or something like that, they might find that they have mood disturbances and struggle to sleep, cognitive disturbances. About 60% of people with Parkinson's are also diagnosed with depression, and that depression usually manifests well before their motor symptoms start to present. The non-motor symptoms do have a significant impact on people with Parkinson's. And it is a bit of a chicken and egg situation where, with a deteriorating bodily function, your mood is significantly affected. Your mood is also affected by the disease, and that might affect your motivation to fight against the process of the disease. So, people with Parkinson's certainly are up against a lot. One of my favorite quotes that a member of our group always says is that I have Parkinson's, but Parkinson's doesn't have me. Is this kind of mantra that he keeps going by, because it is a really, really debilitating condition.
David Dent reflected on seeing the decline in Saylor's condition. Once again, as the quality of the audio from his interview is degraded, this is a transcript of what he told me 20 years ago. He used to do his evening shopping in Beaconsfield. I can still see him at this cafe. It used to be called Charlie's Cafe. It had rather deep steps, and I could see that as Saylor got worse, as his Parkinson's started to hook him, he battled more and more to get up and down those steps.
A big part of the management of Parkinson's disease is almost overriding your autonomic nervous system, your subconscious brain, and trying to take those functions into your conscious brain. So where we subconsciously swing our arms when we walk, take big steps, and we're aware of our body in space, we don't bump into things. Someone with Parkinson's has to use their conscious brain to see where they are in space. They have to consciously pick their foot up. They have to consciously take a big step. They have to consciously hold themselves up straight, because posture is also a subconscious function. So it is possible, but the difficult thing is that you then can't be distracted. So a lot of people with Parkinson's can't go for a walk and chat to you at the same time, because they're thinking about walking. So if you obviously, sharing the latest gossip from, something that your auntie did, they're not going to be able to walk because they're distracted by you. So it really changes and limits what they're able to do in a day, because things that used to be so easy and so subconscious now require their full focused attention.
Malan's condition would rapidly worsen. He would return to the UK regularly for additional treatment. But these visits also gave those who knew and respected him from his days in the RAF the opportunity to see him again. In 1959, 74 Squadron threw a little reunion for him. Malan didn't typically go out of his way to go to reunions or meet up with people. So they organized a small party for him. That special reunion with his beloved 74 Squadron and fellow flying comrades was to be bittersweet.
So there are some fantastic photos in the archive of the 74 Squadron where he's surrounded by friends, and you can see he's generally smiling. It's a proper sailor smile on those photos. It's not one of those propaganda photos where he's clenching his jaw. He's genuinely happy to be surrounded by his friends again. And they also organized a visit to airbase.
There was a Spitfire Fluor display, a Hunter Fluor display, and of course he spent time with the squadron. He said the squadron was as fresh as new as it had ever been.
And he also, for the last time, he sits in a Spitfire at Biggin Hill, and you can see the smile on his face. There's this photo of him sitting in a Spitfire, which is nearly a carbon copy of a photo taken during the war. If he placed them next to each other, you can see how much he's aged, how much weight he's lost, and you can see he really isn't healthy. But he smiles because he's back in his Spitfire, and that would be the last time he saw a Spitfire, but he saw his comrades and many of those he fought with.
He took more trips in the hope that something may be found to cure or alleviate his decline. On one occasion, the family didn't tell anybody. He saw another specialist, but at this time, he was terminally ill and just stayed in his hotel room.
And that's when he gives his heartbreaking interview it was one of his last interviews, where he says, now I will really live. I'm going to be okay. I'm really going to enjoy life now. Just another close brush with death, and I'm going to be okay.
It can be a very debilitating condition. The rate at which the disease progresses varies from person to person. And there's also a pattern of having an on period and an off period, especially now with medication for the disease. So a person with Parkinson's may have a really good day where they get up and they're able to dress themselves and walk 10 kilometers and come back and make a meal and be fine. And they may find that the following day, they have a very off day, or it could even fluctuate within the day. Some people will use a framework of like 5 stages of Parkinson's. The way it basically will classify a person is according to their level of function. The initial stage is being diagnosed, but still largely independent and functional. Second stage is you require assistance with certain activities, but you're still mostly independent. You might step back from your occupation or certain activities that you used to partake in, recreational activities, etc. Maybe if you used to cook, someone might cook less because their disease has reached that point. So because it is so variable, it is classified basically according to what you are able to do, not necessarily according to an objective measure of your strength or your range of movement or those kinds of things. And so, of course, that steadily declines until stage 5, which is usually a point where a patient is not able to walk, even to the point that they'll struggle to turn in bed. They can't dress themselves. They can't feed themselves. They can't swallow. They'll become absolutely dependent on full-time care for all of their functions, basically. It's not impossible for people to kind of graduate through the stages and then kind of go into remission and to improve and go back and become more functional and to actually start walking. There are some really beautiful cases of people regaining a lot of function as a result of community and exercise and a good treatment regime. The timelines for the progression are unknown.
His letters reveal how new potential medications gave him some hope for a change in his condition, but they also reveal the relapses and inability to travel anymore. Dear Mr. Duxbury, I very much regret not having replied to your letter of August 31st. I unfortunately had a relapse in my illness and was quite unable to write. I am pleased to report that I am on the mend again under new drugs. And in a later letter, in response to being unable to attend the museum in Johannesburg to observe his medals on display, thanks for the invitation to the opening of the exhibition and for inquiring after my health. I have inflammation of the nervous system in the brain with all kinds of distressing symptoms. It will burn itself out in time. I would very much like to see the exhibition and might go in during my next visit to the specialist in Johannesburg. Yours sincerely, A.G. Malan.
Rakesh Haribai is the founding director of Parkinson's disease South Africa. He was drawn into the world of this disease following his mother's diagnosis.
For me personally, because I was actually working in Johannesburg in South Africa, and my mum basically was living in Durban. So the first time I heard that she had Parkinson's was when she was diagnosed. The experience of anyone as a family member or a caregiver is a very lonely journey because your diagnosis is led by a neurologist, which doesn't cover the entire sort of breadth of the disease and the journey that one is about to go to. So therefore, you're left to your own devices, which can actually be quite scary. It's hard to basically be in the present when you're dealing with a regressive condition, and I think that's a challenge on its own. And then coming back to the support system, I mean, I think it was Michael J. Fox that said that the person with the Parkinson's is the actual expert. And so surrounding yourself with a number of experts that actually can relate to your disease and sort of share their experiences and offer a handy tip here and there, is incredibly therapeutic for people with Parkinson's.
And so it was on a South African Airways flight back from London that Sailor Malan would look through the cockpit window at the landscape, the towns, and his long-remembered Biggin Hill for the last time. Linda would take him back to Benfontein, where she would nurse him and take him outside for regular physiotherapy.
because very often Parkinson's patients are very stiff and rigid, Michelle's work as a physiotherapist focuses on maintaining or regaining the strength of the muscles, as well as the range of motion of the muscles.
So you want to help them to be able to move more easily by doing a lot of stretching exercises. And then balance is very critical as well. And then a lot of the work or the exercise that we do is very repetitive, and it does combine both a physical and a cognitive aspect. So it's almost like brain gym. So it's a lot of laterality, moving the left and the right, stretching into your full range of motion, challenging your balance, etc. So you're engaging your muscles, but you are also engaging cognitively. And then the goal of doing repetitive work is that you can actually begin to access your habit center. So functions like walking used to be subconscious, and now you have to rely on your conscious brain to walk. If it can become a habit, it takes a lot less effort. So the more you practice something and you develop the habit of good posture, develop the habit of walking well, the less you have to draw on constantly of cueing yourself to stand up straight, to take big steps, to walk, etc., like that.
I had no idea at that stage of what Parkinson's disease was. But when I saw him sitting in his chair and unable to control his muscular movements, I just thought, hell, what a terrible condition to happen to a chap who was so much alive. And I was surprised that his mind wasn't affected at all. He was sharp as anything and as happy as he could be. He's laughing and smiling, and we talked about our time together. But his body was just falling apart.
Most people would be familiar with the tremor. That's the most common kind of symptom of Parkinson's. And if you were to identify somebody and they don't tell you they have Parkinson's, probably the most clear symptom would be the tremor. But not everybody will develop a tremor. A lot of people who are diagnosed with Parkinson's will maybe manifest more in their non-motor symptoms, or their motor symptoms might look like something called bradykinesia, which is just slowness of movement. So incredibly slow to take steps, incredibly slow to reach for something. Or dyskinesia, which is more of like a dancing kind of writhing type of movement, which is incredibly exhausting and tiring. If you see somebody, they can't sit still the entire time, sitting in the chair, moving, wriggling. It's a neural function and they cannot keep still if they try. But I think people from the outside wouldn't necessarily identify that as Parkinson's immediately. So it's a very challenging disease to have, because you yourself may not fully understand everything that's happening within you. And it's a whole other thing for those around you to understand.
Malan's mind remained as fertile as ever, but he couldn't speak properly or articulate words. A close friend would remark that his sense of humor, however, was still intact.
Something that sadly I do remember was when he made light of it, and he used to laugh about the way he couldn't go through a doorway without bumping into one or other side of the doorway, and he'd laugh away as if it was a huge joke.
Rakesh also saw the day-to-day impact on his mother's life and how she tried to cope with the disease.
My mum was very old school, summa cum laude in home economics. So our house was a castle. And the biggest challenge for her was not being able to have a house clean and 3 meals cooked a day and baking and, everything else that someone with summa cum laude in home economics is able to basically do. That's the frustration. But again, I think with any of these diseases, it's about acceptance.
After losing touch for a few years, Crispian Trace clearly remembered the last time he saw his friend, Sailor.
I'd seen him as a virile young man, and he was now a shriveled person, just a shell of his former self. His mind was still there. When I walked in, he gave me a huge grin and he sat down and we chatted for half an hour or so. And he said to me, "Crispin, would you like some tea?" And I said, "Yes, sailor, that would be nice. I'll go and get it in the kitchen." He said, "No, you won't. I'll get it." And I thought, there's no way that this man in his state can actually get up out of the chair and move and control his shakes sufficiently to make the tea and bring it. Anyway, he disappeared into the kitchen, and it didn't take him long. I didn't hear any crashing or banging. He was back with a tray of tea, and he put it down, and I said, "Shall I pour it?" And he said, "No." And he picked up the teapot, and he picked up the cup, and shaking both his hands like anything, he poured the cup of tea perfectly, and he passed it to me with the biggest grin you've ever seen. He wanted to show me that, bugger this Parkinson's disease, he could still do what he had to do. And, you know, that to me is what has stuck in my brain about Sailor. He did what he had to do. And how he did it, I don't know, but he just had the determination to do it and do it properly. When I came away from there, I was in tears. I was just absolutely crying my heart out. And I knew that I would never see him again. And I never did.
The symptoms fluctuate, limiting your ability to undertake basic functions. But, as Malan demonstrated with his insistence on making tea for Crispian, you can focus enough to achieve certain tasks, but with great effort and concentration.
You lose focus, you lose balance, you miss your mouth when you're trying to feed yourself. Another non-motor symptom of Parkinson's is your cognitive abilities. So your abilities to kind of plan and organize. So things like cooking and making a cup of tea actually become really, really difficult.
Jonathan Malan recalls, after receiving a letter from his mother to return home from the UK, seeing his father for the first time in 2 years.
When I first saw him after coming back from England, the difference in just 2 years that I was away, I had to bite my tongue, excuse myself, and go to my room and bawl my head off because he was so pathetic. Even the deterioration of 2 years was that rapid. And I was relieved when he died because he was so helpless and so frustrated with this disease. It appeared that his mind was still there, but because it's a disease of the nervous system, he couldn't speak, he couldn't articulate words. He was very frustrated. Could not carry on a conversation. I think my mother was the only one who could understand him at the time.
As Sailor's illness continued to take hold, a comrade from his days in the RAF would pay him a visit.
At one point, his friend Al Deer was a member of the few who comes to visit him at Benfontein. And very few of them were aware of how bad his condition really was. And when Al Deer sees him, and he's absolutely a shadow of his former self, he's barely able to speak. Al Deer is one of the few, someone who survived the Battle of Britain. He bursts into tears, and so does Sailor, and they both realize they'll never see each other again. And Al was the last member of the few to see him alive as well.
He was now very weak and only saw close friends and family at that stage. He slept most of the day, but he was surrounded by his family, as both his children had returned to Kimberley to spend the last few months with him. By September 1963, it was clear he was fading away, and he was moved from Benfontein to the hospital in Kimberley. There, on the 17th of September 1963, Group Captain Adolf Gijsbert Sailor Malan died, aged 52, of pneumonia. Following the news of his passing, Winston Churchill, Jonathan's godfather, wrote a letter of condolence. "My dear Jonathan, I was grieved to learn of the death of your father, whose deeds added luster to the name of the Royal Air Force in the great days of the war. Pray accept my true sympathy to you and your family. Yours very sincerely, Winston S. Churchill."
He was suffering from Parkinson's disease 4 years, and the progression was rapid. I'm glad about that. I wouldn't have liked to watch him, old and frail, for 15 or 20 years, as happens with some Parkinson's disease sufferers. I was very relieved that he died within 4 years.
And it was a real honor to have known him. Douglas Bader was a friend of my father's, and he came to stay with us when I was very young on the farm. And my father said to me, go down and open the gate for him. And I knew that he had 2 tin legs. So I went down to the gate and was about to open the gate when Douglas said, leave it closed, and jumped over it. And he turned to me and said, there's nothing wrong with my legs, and marched into the house. And I feel incredibly privileged to have known those 2 really great men. And they were very, very similar. They must have known each other. Douglas Bader was in fighter command at the same time that Saylor was. But they were both unbelievable people. And there's no doubt about it that Saylor in particular shaped a lot of my life. Just out of his pure determination and decency and kindness.
Fellow aces Douglas Bader, Al Deere, and Johnny Johnson would call him the RAF's greatest fighter pilot. In the USA, an American correspondent would call him the greatest fighter pilot of all time. Professor Andrew Crouch, Vice Chancellor and Principal at Sol Plaatje University in Kimberley, in a university press release on the 21st of September 2023 wrote, apart from his aerial combat skills, Sailor Malan can also be counted as one of the very first anti-apartheid struggle heroes. Although he has received little recognition for his work as leader of the Torch Commando, he continues to remain an activist and frontrunner for equality in the history books. Some would see him as brash and uncompromising. Others would see him as a seemingly modest, softly spoken man. For a moment in time, though, he stared into the abyss during humankind's darkest hour and took to the skies. He would then attempt to alter his country's own journey into another abyss and fail. At the height of the Battle of Britain, Winston Churchill would exclaim, "Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few." In London, announcing his passing, the Daily Herald and Times would simply refer to him as the king of the few. While the praise received in the UK and the US was glowing, back home in South Africa, the government, bitter to the end, refused to give him a military funeral, and the government press said little, if anything, about his achievements.
The response from the South African government is not to send any condolences to the family. The only response is to say he's not allowed to have a military funeral, and the South African Air Force is not allowed to pay tribute to him in any way, shape, or form. The Afrikaans language newspapers grudgingly published an obituary but made no reference to his Torch Commando days, just as this guy flew Spitfire some time ago and moving on. Obviously, the South African English language press responded a bit differently. They noted his Torch Commando career, they noted the crucial role he played during the Battle of Britain and beyond. In contrast, there was a full-page article in the London Times, an obituary in the New York Times. So globally, his passing was marked with great sadness and affection as well.
Shortly after Saylor passed away, within days it was clear that the government were not going to afford him a military funeral, and they banned military service members from attending in uniform.
In response to that, the mayor of Kimberley said, we'll afford him a civic funeral, which is the next level down, basically. And that meant things like moving to the funeral, they had outriders, the mayor was present, led proceedings, the mayor's chaplain was present as well. Everything they could afford as a city was conferred on Saylor. So he wasn't allowed a military funeral, but he got the next best thing. And it was a very courageous thing to do by the city of Kimberley and by the mayor. And it shows the depth of respect they had for him as well. They definitely banned military service members from attending in uniform, and they were strongly discouraged and told, this was told to me by people who had relatives who wanted to attend who worked for the government. It was told in no uncertain terms, you can go, but you'll regret it. Some of it was official, like you can't attend in uniform, straight up. But some of it was a bit more subtle, like, yes, you work for the government. If you go, be assured you won't have a job by the end of the week.
Disregarding the South African government's attitude and directives, and as a direct snub to them, Malan's civic funeral was attended by people from all over the world, including the RAF, his comrades in arms, family, friends, and others.
So he passes away, he's not religious. That's another problem. So he needs to be buried from somewhere. And St. Cyprian's Cathedral, the Anglican Church in Kimberley, they step up.
Kenneth Oram, who was the Dean of Kimberley, the rector of the cathedral, had been the officiant at the service. And I'd met Kenneth Oram many years later because of a musical context. I was a member of the choir here at St. Cyprian's after the early 60s.
Oram was the dean at St. Cyprian's at the time when apartheid was being established, which meant that places like churches were meant to segregate. But not every church heeded that call. Father Reginald Liu, until recently the dean of St. Cyprian's himself, remembers the origins of the cathedral and the intention at its founding to be non-racial.
From the beginning, it was very clear that this was not a white project, nor a black project, but it was a joint project. And as you can see, when you look at the crest of the diocese, the way it's put together, it's a black and a white cross in the middle, which is trying to show that. And the crest is surrounded by diamonds because at that time, Kimberley diamonds were discovered and Kimberley was booming. So that's where the money would have come from to keep the ministry going. So I think just from the onset, the Diocese of Kimberley and Kurumwan was set out to be a joint project between blacks and whites. So that's the history. That has always been what St. Cyprian's Cathedral was about. It was welcoming to all, and I believe it comes from the beginning, from those who were pioneers, who were very clear on what they were doing.
And so the cathedral was never actually segregated. And right next door to where the cathedral is was a place that was called Malay Camp, which was Kimberley's equivalent of District 6 in Cape Town. So there was always a very large part of the St. Cyprian's congregation that was not white. And so it was a mixed congregation that he served, and it continues like that to this day. It was in that context that the funeral took place, at a non-segregated place within an apartheid city. And so the church was certainly taking a stand. I think it was a beacon of protest.
This is a few months before the start of the infamous Rivonia trial, basically 18 months after the Sharpeville massacre. So these are very dark days in South Africa. And despite this, the US Air Force military attaché was Flight Lieutenant Furman. He goes to the ambassador and he says, we need to honor this man. The ambassador wasn't crazy about the idea of us sending a military attaché. So somewhere maybe at the top of the food chain, someone had to okay it. And if it did go all the way to the White House, John F. Kennedy was the president. He would obviously be assassinated a few months after that. But he was a World War II veteran as well. And his brother, Joe Kennedy, flew airplanes as well and died in combat. So who knows, maybe he had something to say about that. It was an incredible gesture to send someone in during those very dark times, to send a representative in full uniform to attend the funeral of someone who was very vocally anti-apartheid and was very much hated by the apartheid government. I can't think of a single other example where they did something like that.
The US sent a military attaché from the newly established US Air Force to attend the funeral in full uniform. Likewise, the RAF sent a military attaché.
And if you look at photos of the funeral, you can see Harry Oppenheimer carrying the casket along with some of his De Beers colleagues, and the other photos, these uniformed men from other armed forces carrying the casket. into the West End Cemetery. And that took a great deal of not just compassion, but courage.
For me, it's very clear. It's very clear in that because of Cecilia Malan's role and resistance to apartheid, that St. Cyprian's Cathedral would have been an obvious place for him to have his funeral. I don't think that the National Party, given their agenda, would have allowed people to attend Cecilia Malan's funeral. And simply because what he stood for. Because what Cecilia Malan stood for, was against the apartheid policy. So they were not going to create a platform where people will be made aware and be conscientized. Funerals in South Africa are very volatile, especially in the funerals of those who fought against apartheid. They became a rallying force. They became a place where people were kind of made aware, conscientized, but also encouraged to do something about their freedom.
As Yvonne Malan also states, Kimberley showed incredible courage and compassion by giving Malan a civic funeral, which was one of the largest in the history of the city.
And I've been told this, I don't know if it's true, as the casket left St. Cyprian's Cathedral, the Falcons whipped past the casket, and as the motorcade left, there was a German veteran who didn't feel comfortable enough attending the funeral, but as they moved past, he saluted them.
Although a portrait in his honor would be unveiled at South Africa House in London in the early 1990s, he remains a largely forgotten figure in the country of his birth, even once apartheid had come to an end and the first democratic election had taken place.
I think during the apartheid years under the Afrikaners, you had an all-encompassing Afrikaner nationalist narrative that dominated the stories we told. It was all the heroism and the victimhood of the Afrikaners. And we actually just had one nationalism being replaced by another nationalism. And after 1994, you have the ANC and the struggle narrative replacing the Afrikaner nationalist narrative. And in that struggle narrative, the ANC is central. So all these other organizations are sideshows, if they are even mentioned. I mean, the Black Sash, which is, an important women's organization, you hardly ever hear of them, except maybe in passing. The Pan-Africanist Congress, even the Black Consciousness Movement, it all becomes sideshows. The Torch Commando is hardly mentioned. It just doesn't fit into this Central Africanist narrative. One finds that white dissidents who are acknowledged were very often those who, in some way or other, still aligned with the ANC. And the most famous example is Bram Fischer, who was a very prominent Afrikaner, who was a member of the Communist Party and who defended Nelson Mandela and is co-accused at the Rivonia treason trial. So he is easily integrated into the narrative. The other person is Beyers Naudé, who was a Dutch Reformed cleric who left the church again to establish himself as an anti-apartheid activist. But those are almost the only white men who have been integrated into the new narrative. All the others have just somehow disappeared into obscurity. And I think Sailor Malan and the Torch Commando suffer from almost a double dose of being ignored. He was already written out of the Afrikaner nationalist narrative. Now he has been written out of the African nationalist narrative as well.
So he's not acknowledged after 94, when South Africa becomes a democracy. One would think he would be somebody who would be celebrated for his courage, but he's not. And some people felt that he flew for the Royal Air Force, so he wasn't South African enough, which is obviously ignoring his Torch Commando role.
Although he didn't fly for the South African Air Force, he was still a South African. He fought in the war, the same war that South Africa fought in, although he was flying for the RAF. But still, he's a South African, or he was a South African. He's one of our heroes.
In 2018, Yvonne Malan was asked to become the vice president and patron of the Spitfire Society, She was also the vice president and patron of the RAF Hornchurch Aerodrome Historical Trust. They do an incredible amount to honor the few and everybody who fought in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. She was then asked to become an ambassador for the National Spitfire project, with a monument due to be inaugurated in 2025 in Southampton, close to the airfield where the Spitfire took its maiden flight in 1936.
I said yes after conversations with a few people I respect and trust. And I thought one of the reasons, or the main reason I said yes, was it could put me in a position where people would listen if I said something about Sailor. I could see there was interest and people did remember him, and people across the world, which was very interesting. And people would reach out and say, my grandfather served with him or my uncle knew him. And it just emphasized the fact that this man needs to be remembered and honored.
In 2022, a chance conversation between Yvonne and another member of the family prompted her to realize that 2023 would be the 60th anniversary of Sailor's death. Also, after a hiatus of 12 years, the city of Cape Town reopened the civic honours process.
In December 2022, I wrote a motivation was Sailor should receive a civic honour from the city of Cape Town. I was a bit doubtful because firstly, you only had 350 words to nominate him. Secondly, I was worried about how many people would actually know his name. I thought it was a very, very long shot getting him honoured. But I filled in the forms and then just hope for the best. And then I think it was August 2023, I got an email from the mayor saying, congratulations, Sailor Malan will be honoured at the December Civic Honours ceremony by the city of Cape Town. And that was the first time ever he's been honoured by any government structure in South Africa, and that more than half a century after his death. A few of us had an idea of, family members had an idea of going to Kimberley in September, which was the 60th anniversary of his death, to just to visit his grave, lay a wreath, pay our respects. We weren't entirely sure where the grave was. So I reached out to the McGregor Museum in Kimberley, and by absolute chance, the person who answered my message was a person called Dr. David Morris, who not only knew exactly who Sailor was, but his own father was a member of the Torch Commando.
I've been running the McGregor Museum Facebook page, and there was this query that came through, which started off fairly tentatively: is the West End Cemetery a safe place to go to? And so I expressed interest in what the context was, and then it was mentioned that it was an anniversary of an event dating from the 17th of September 1963, and it had an Air Force link, and I very quickly put two and two together, and then of course the name Malan clicked. And so there were various stages of preparation. We had to make sure that we knew exactly where the grave was, and I was involved in just tidying up around the site and making things ready.
From there, it kind of snowballed. We decided that weekend, on the 16th of September, we're going to have a Sailor Malan memorial lecture, and the Sunday we would go to the cemetery and place wreaths, and then just grew exponentially.
And I think it's just by coincidence because his funeral was came out of St. Cyprian's Cathedral, and I was the dean then. Because otherwise, I don't think I would have heard about Sailor Malan. I thought Sailor Malan was a remarkable man, that a place like St. Cyprian Cathedrals would want to be associated with. So I was from the onset happy about that, because I was given an opportunity to say a few words at the graveside. What was very significant for me was that Sailor Malan was kind of a light for us, especially in South Africa today, where we seem to have lost our ideals. You know what we were hoping for our freedom. And it was refreshing, to hear about Sailor Malan and what he stood for. And I thought that was, for me, a light in darkness, a direction that we as a country can take, because others have laid the foundation. It was just to build up on those ideas.
60 years on from recognizing Malan's contributions to the war effort at his funeral, the US government also reaffirmed their admiration in the recent commemorations.
I invited the US Embassy, and the response was extraordinary. Just like in 1963, they turned up. Not only did they send the military attaché, but also the UN ambassador, Dr. Ruben Brigitte. He flew out all the way to Kimberley to attend the lecture. So it was deeply moving that just as in 1963, the American embassy played a key role. I'm forever grateful for the role they played. It was just an extraordinary group of people who came together to make it possible. Richard Harding from Moth in Kimberley, who organized the pipe and drum band from the Kimberley Regiment. It was incredibly moving to have them there at the cemetery. Christo du Toit from the South African Air Force Association, the Dean of St. Cyprian's, Reverend Reginald Leo, he conducted a short service at the cemetery itself on the Sunday. And Nicky Oppenheimer, whose father, Harry Oppenheimer, Sally's closest friend, Captain Tony Nicholas from the General Boerta Old Boys Association. He played an absolutely vital role in organizing especially the events on the Sunday. The Scouts attended, along with the Landsteins, which is the Afrikaans version of the Scouts. So yeah, these kids were born 50 years after Sailor passed away. Kids of all races, they formed the honor guard as we placed the reefs.
I just stood there and actually remembered all of the great times we had together. It took me back to the time that Sailor and I were younger, both of us, and just the fun that we'd had. I'm a great believer in extrasensory perception, and I just had the feeling that Sailor would actually know that I was there. I had actually come to say goodbye to him. The loss to me of Sailor was a major loss in my life.
Yvonne Malan reflects that the commemorations in 2023 are proof of what happens when you get an extraordinary group of people together for the right reasons. They were there for Sailor Malan, and it just showed that his legacy goes on.
He is a very relatable hero. He represents courage and character and resilience and selflessness. I fear no man is the motto of 7-4 Squadron. It was more than mere words to him. It was part of the fibre of his being. It was his true north. For the truly courageous, fighting the good fight is nearly instinctive. Sailor Malan's courage and sense of justice were not willed. They were the consequence of his character and his humanity. Sailor Malan never saw himself as a hero. He was an ordinary man who found himself in the arena, from the Battle of Britain to the fight against apartheid. There are moments in his life that steered him towards greatness. Without these decisive moments, he might well have remained Adolf Malan from Wellington.
Sailor Malan was for me a guide, especially in a time where I feel like South Africans, we've lost our direction. I saw that as an opportunity for us to return back to the ideals of freedom, of equality, of living in peace side by side.
We would like to thank the McGregor Museum for introducing us to Yvonne Malan, who not only allowed us to quote extensively from her Sailor Malan Memorial Lecture given in Kimberley and Simonstown in 2023, but also introduced us to the majority of participants and one-on-one interviews in the podcast. Thank you to everyone who gave their time, insights, and participation.
Face the Attack, The Three Battles of Sailor Malan was written and produced by Protea Rose Originals. Keep following for bonus content and additional updates. Protea Rose Originals is based in Halifax, Canada, and led by Cliff Thompson and Nick Fieldsend. We produce original stories from the real world through TV, film, podcasts, audio, digital, and printed books.